Here's a question for you. How many of you have heard of the crazy African dictator who thought he was the next Napoleon? This video, of course, is all about Jean-Bédel Bokassa, better known as Bokassa I, the one and only Emperor of the Central African Empire. African history unfortunately tends to get left out a lot of the time, and we tend to forget that sometimes African history can be just as rich, if not richer, and more fascinating than European history. So ladies and gentlemen, here's a wacky story for you. So to give you a bit of context, we're talking about the Central African Republic here, right in the middle of the African continent, one of the poorest nations on the continent, unfortunately, with its capital in Bangui. It used to be a French colony under the name Ubangui-Chari, which itself was part of French Equatorial Africa, which of course was part of the much wider French Empire, with all of its possessions in Africa, Asia, and so on. The French had arrived in that area around the end of the 1800s and imposed their culture, of course, on the native people of that land that were around the Ubangi River, which is, of course, where the capital, Bangui, gets its name from. Of course, after the end of World War II, it was becoming more and more common for imperial countries to decolonise, to let go of their former possessions and colonies and grant them independence. The British Empire did the same with India, and France was starting to feel that exact same international pressure. The French government decided to remedy this by allowing the native people of what is now the Central African Republic to vote for their own representatives in 1946, and they chose Barthélemy Boganda, who would later go on to create the political party known as Maslin. Unfortunately, I don't speak French, so I can't tell you what Maslin actually stands for in French, but translated, it basically means the Movement for the Social Evolution of Black Africa. Maslin. Eventually, in 1960, France decided to let go of the territories around the Ubangi River, granting independence to the Central African Republic, whose first president was a cousin of Barthélemy Boganda's, whose name was David Dacko. As the country's first official president, David Dacko decided to give control over the armed forces to another cousin of his, Jean-Bédel Bokassa. Bokassa had been a soldier in the Second World War. He fought for the Free France against the Vichy forces, and as one of the most famed and prestigious generals in the new Central African Republic, his cousin, President Dacko, of course, gave him control over the army. I must say that you can clearly see a little bit of nepotism here, of putting relatives, family members in government positions. It's rampant across the African continent. Has been for the past century, really. Eventually, the government of David Dacko began to crumble. The economy went downhill, and he began to resort to communist China for help, leading to communist propaganda spreading across the country like wildfire, and his own personal popularity hitting rock bottom. General Bokassa, the main character of today's story, of course, had had enough. After constant arguments with his cousin, President Dacko, and even after being briefly dismissed from his position as head of the armed forces, he decided to take matters into his own hands. On New Year's Eve of 1965, he led the Saint Sylvester coup d'etat, ousting David Dacko from power and becoming the new president of the Central African Republic on the 1st of January 1966. The rise to power of Jean-Bédel Bokassa marked a considerably authoritarian shift in Central African politics, becoming more and more like a dictator, repressing his enemies, giving more and more power to himself, becoming supreme general, and eventually president for life. But that still wasn't enough for him. The economy of the Central African Republic hadn't recovered all too well, and they were kind of struggling for international recognition from other countries as well. Bokassa believed he had the solution. He knew exactly what to do. Crown himself emperor. Bokassa believed that in order to make the CAR greater and more sovereign, more likely to get recognised by other countries, then it needed a different, stronger type of government. A monarchy, with himself at the head. Bokassa idolised Napoleon Bonaparte, the historic French emperor, and he believed that he was exactly the Napoleon that his country needed. So, in December of 1976, Jean-Bédel Bokassa officially abolished the Central African Republic and created the Central African Empire, with himself as Bokassa I, Emperor of Central Africa by the will of the Central African people, united within the national political party, the Maslin. Christ, that's a long title. For his coronation ceremony, he ordered the creation of these huge, lavish robes and gowns, a diamond-encrusted crown, and a massive golden throne. and his guards would be offered these Napoleonic-style uniforms from the 1800s. He was fully going for it. Since there wasn't really a royal palace or anything really fitting for the coronation of an emperor, they held the event at a sports stadium, and they even invited the Pope to come along. They invited loads of world leaders to come along. But everybody declined, because they all thought he was absolutely mental. The reason why Emperor Bokassa wanted the Pope there was because he wanted to recreate a scene from Napoleon's coronation, where Napoleon snatches the crown off of the Pope and places it on his own head. And he did something similar, just from the Archbishop of Bangui. Wasn't the Pope. But still, he got his moment. And by the way, did I mention that the whole ceremony cost 20 million US dollars, which was the whole French aid for that year and about a third of the country's budget? Basically, he broke the country with his own coronation. Later on, at the dinner party held after the coronation, journalists found out a shocking truth. The meat that they were eating was actually human meat. Bokassa was a cannibal. He even told the journalists himself, "You didn't know, but you're actually eating human meat." The journalists, of course, were absolutely disgusted, and rumours spread like wildfire about the new cannibal emperor of Central Africa. His reputation just went downhill from there. During his time as emperor, Bokassa I committed widespread human rights abuses, torturing and killing anyone he saw as an enemy, and they say that he himself used to beat prisoners up with his own cane. Luckily, this complete and utter psychopath only ruled as emperor from 1976 until 1979. So what brought about the end of his reign? Basically, he changed the rules regarding school uniforms, forcing students to wear his face on their uniforms. Of course, loads of students protested. And how did the Bokassa regime respond? By killing innocent children. France responded with severity. Enough was enough. The French government sent a load of soldiers into Bangui in what came to be known as Operation Barracuda and successfully ousted Bokassa I from his throne. The Central African Republic was restored and David Dacko was once again president of Central Africa. After a brief period of exile in the Ivory Coast, upon his return to Bangui, Bokassa was arrested and locked up in prison for his crimes against the Central African people, until he was released in 1993 by the then President Kolimba. He spent the rest of his days in Bangui, living a quiet life really, until he died in 1996. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the crazy story of Bokassa I, the Emperor of Central Africa. I really hope you enjoyed this video, guys. If you did, please click that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.